I honestly thought it was going to be a normal Thursday night, just another corporate event where I'd stand around holding a glass of something overpriced while Lauren worked the room and introduced me as her husband with that polished smile she saves for clients. The Halcyon Tower in downtown Chicago was exactly what you'd expect from a place that hosts exclusive executive networking experiences, all glass walls, soft golden lighting, and a terrace that overlooked the city like it was something the company owned. The skyline glittered behind us, Lake Michigan stretched into darkness, and everyone there looked like they had stepped out of a business magazine. I remember adjusting my jacket in the reflection of the glass doors, telling myself not to look out of place. Lauren barely looked at me once we stepped inside. She did that subtle shoulder roll she does when she switches into work mode, like she's shrugging off her real life. Within seconds, she was scanning the crowd, already smiling at someone across the terrace. Before I could even finish saying I was going to grab us drinks, she spotted him. Kyle Bennett. I'd heard the name before, usually followed by something about how brilliant or dynamic he was in strategy meetings. What I hadn't seen before was the way her entire face lit up when she saw him. She walked straight toward him, not even checking if I was following, and then she did something that made my stomach drop. She threw her arms around him. Not a polite side hug. Not the kind of brief, professional embrace you give a coworker at a celebration. It was close, lingering, familiar. He lifted her slightly off the ground and laughed like they were the only two people in the room. I stood there holding both of our coats like an idiot, watching my wife cling to another man while a group of executives stood only a few feet away pretending not to notice. When she finally pulled away, she didn't introduce me right away. She kept her hand on his chest as they talked, her body angled completely toward him. I had to step closer just to be included in the circle. When she did acknowledge me, it was with this thin smile and a quick, "Oh, this is Brandon," like I was someone she'd bumped into in the elevator. Kyle shook my hand firmly, holding eye contact just long enough to establish something territorial. Lauren laughed at something he said about late nights at the office, and then she glanced at me and muttered, "Don't make things weird, okay," under her breath, still smiling outwardly for the group. That was the moment it stopped feeling like harmless flirting and started feeling staged. She would lean into him when she laughed, brush imaginary lint off his sleeve, compliment his presentation from earlier in the week in a tone I hadn't heard her use at home in months. Every time I tried to join the conversation, she would either talk over me or redirect the attention back to Kyle. At one point I made a light comment about how she practically lives at the office these days, and she shot me a look sharp enough to cut glass before saying, "Brandon exaggerates. He doesn't really understand how demanding real growth roles are." The executives chuckled politely. I felt about 2 inches tall. It wasn't just that she was ignoring me. It was that she was subtly dismantling me in front of people who mattered to her. She corrected small details when I spoke, implied I didn't quite grasp her industry, even joked that I'd get overwhelmed at networking events. Each remark was wrapped in humor, delivered with a laugh, but they landed heavy. Meanwhile, Kyle would smirk slightly, like he was enjoying a private joke at my expense. Standing on that terrace with the Chicago skyline behind us and the wind tugging at my collar, I realized this wasn't spontaneous. It was deliberate. She wanted these people to see her unattached, unburdened, elevated above the guy awkwardly holding a drink beside her. I wasn't her partner there. I was a prop she regretted bringing. I stepped out onto the far edge of the terrace because I couldn't breathe in that room anymore, and the cold Chicago air hit my face hard enough to sting, which honestly felt grounding compared to what was happening inside. The city below looked indifferent, traffic moving in steady lines of red and white, like none of this humiliation mattered in the grand scheme of things. I gripped the railing and tried to steady my thoughts, replaying every interaction from the past few months that suddenly felt different in hindsight, every late meeting, every unexplained dinner, every time she had come home distant and irritated. That was when I heard heels approach behind me, slow and deliberate, not hesitant in the slightest. I turned and immediately recognized Victoria Grant. I had seen her once before at a company gala, and even then she had carried herself like someone who owned every room she entered. She was composed in a way that didn't feel rehearsed but natural, like control was simply her baseline state. Up close, her expression was unreadable, sharp eyes studying me not with pity but with assessment. She didn't waste time with small talk. She stood beside me at the railing, looking out at the skyline instead of directly at me, and said in a calm, measured tone that cut cleaner than any accusation, "You look like a man who has just figured something out." I didn't respond because I didn't trust my voice not to crack. After a brief pause, she continued, telling me that office environments are ecosystems and that patterns become visible long before people involved realize how obvious they are. She said Lauren and Kyle had been inseparable for months, that their so-called collaboration had extended far beyond marketing strategies and client dinners. The way she spoke was analytical, almost clinical, as if she were presenting quarterly results instead of dismantling my marriage. She told me the rumors had circulated quietly at first, then more openly, and that it had become impossible for leadership not to notice. She mentioned the lingering touches, the closed-door meetings that ran hours longer than necessary, the business trips where separate hotel bookings were requested but somehow always adjusted last minute. Every sentence landed with the weight of confirmation rather than speculation. I finally asked her why she was telling me this, and she turned to look at me fully for the first time. There was no sympathy in her eyes, but there was something like resolve. She said emotional confrontations rarely produce truth, they only produce denial and damage control. She told me that if I wanted clarity, I needed to observe, not react, because people reveal far more when they believe they are unchallenged. According to her, Lauren was not careless, she was strategic. She had cultivated an image at work of being ambitious and independent, subtly distancing herself from her personal life in conversations, framing herself as someone unencumbered by domestic distractions. Victoria's voice lowered slightly as she added that Lauren had been balancing narratives, presenting one version of herself at home and another in the office, and that such dual management required intention. She said I deserved to see the full scope of that intention before making any decisions, because once a confrontation happens, stories change and alliances solidify. She wasn't offering comfort, she was offering information and a method. Standing there beside her, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not even anger, but a cold awareness replacing the confusion. The humiliation I felt inside no longer seemed accidental or exaggerated. It fit into a larger pattern that had been forming quietly behind my back. Victoria straightened her posture, smoothed her sleeve, and told me simply to pay attention, to watch without signaling that I was watching, because truth surfaces most clearly when it thinks it is safe. Then she stepped back toward the warm glow of the party, leaving me alone with the city lights and a reality that suddenly felt far more calculated than I had ever imagined. The shift started the very next morning, and it was so abrupt that if I hadn't spent the previous night staring at the ceiling replaying Victoria's words in my head, I might have mistaken it for coincidence. I woke up to the smell of coffee and something sweet, which was unusual because Lauren normally rushed out early with nothing more than a protein bar and a distracted kiss on my cheek. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already dressed but wearing an apron over her blouse, smiling too brightly as she flipped pancakes like we were in some kind of commercial for domestic bliss. She greeted me with exaggerated warmth, told me she thought we deserved a reset morning, and kissed me longer than she had in months. I watched her move around the kitchen with this almost theatrical energy, narrating what she was doing, asking if I preferred blueberries or strawberries, insisting I sit down while she handled everything. Her tone was soft, attentive, carefully modulated. It felt practiced, like she had studied how a devoted spouse should sound and was now delivering the performance. I answered politely, kept my voice steady, and paid attention the way Victoria had suggested. Lauren's eyes flicked to my face repeatedly, scanning for micro-reactions, trying to read whether I knew something. Over the next few days the pattern intensified. She suggested a spontaneous date night at a restaurant I had mentioned months ago. She sent me affectionate texts in the middle of the workday, complete with inside jokes she hadn't referenced in a long time. She initiated physical closeness constantly, resting her hand on my arm when we watched television, leaning into me on the couch, asking if I felt loved enough. Every gesture felt amplified, as if she were overcorrecting an unseen mistake. What stood out most was how often she circled back to the party without directly mentioning it. She would casually ask how I felt about her coworkers, whether I thought corporate events were uncomfortable for me, whether anyone had said anything strange while she was busy networking. The questions were disguised as concern, but there was a subtle urgency underneath them. One evening while washing dishes she asked, in a tone that tried too hard to sound neutral, whether I had spoken to Victoria on the terrace. She didn't look at me when she asked, focusing instead on a spotless plate she continued scrubbing. I told her we had exchanged a few words about the view and the company's growth trajectory, keeping my answer bland and uneventful. I watched her shoulders loosen slightly, watched her exhale in relief before catching herself and smiling. That was when it became undeniable to me that this sudden devotion wasn't about reconnecting, it was about containment. She was assessing damage, calculating what I might have heard, adjusting her behavior accordingly. At night she would curl up beside me and talk about our future in a way that sounded almost scripted, mentioning long-term plans, vacations we should take, investments we could make together. The intensity of it felt disconnected from reality, like she was building a narrative in real time and hoping repetition would make it solid. I responded calmly, never accusatory, never cold enough to alarm her, but distant enough that I could observe without being pulled back into the illusion. The hardest part was recognizing how skilled she was at it. If I hadn't seen the terrace, if I hadn't heard Victoria's precise, unsettling breakdown, I might have accepted this version of Lauren as genuine effort. Instead, every affectionate touch felt like a strategic move on a board I hadn't realized we were playing on. I began to see our marriage not as something quietly deteriorating, but as something she was actively managing, adjusting tone and gestures the way she would adjust a campaign presentation. She wasn't reconnecting with me, she was stabilizing her position. And the more perfect she tried to appear, the clearer it became that perfection was the costume, not the truth. The idea sat in my mind for 3 days before I acted on it, circling like something I didn't want to name because once named it would become real. I had never considered myself the kind of person who would invade someone's privacy, especially not my wife's, but privacy implies trust, and trust had already been fractured in ways that no polite breakfast or rehearsed affection could repair. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening when Lauren said she needed to wash her hair before an early client dinner the next morning and disappeared into the bathroom with the shower running loud enough to cover any subtle noise. Her designer tote was on the chair by the bedroom door, the same bag she carried to every meeting, every trip, every so-called late strategy session. My hands felt heavier than they should have as I unzipped it, and for a brief moment I just stared at the contents, her planner neatly tucked inside, her makeup pouch, her tablet, everything arranged with the same meticulous order she applied to her professional image. I slipped the small tracking device into the inner lining pocket beneath a stack of documents, positioning it where it wouldn't be discovered during casual use. My pulse was loud in my ears, and I kept expecting the shower to shut off suddenly, expecting her to walk out and catch me in an act I would have never imagined committing a month earlier. As I zipped the bag closed and set it back exactly where it had been, a wave of guilt washed over me, sharp and suffocating. I stood there staring at the door, questioning whether I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But then images from the terrace surfaced uninvited, her arms around Kyle, her whispered warning not to make things weird, the deliberate way she minimized me in front of people whose opinions shaped her career. I reminded myself that whatever moral boundary I had stepped over tonight had already been eroded long before by deception. This was not about control, I told myself, it was about clarity. The first alert came the next afternoon while I was at work. I had installed the app on my phone under a neutral name, something that wouldn't draw attention if she happened to glance at my screen. She had told me she would be at a client meeting in downtown Austin, something about expanding Brightwave's presence in the tech sector. The map showed her moving as expected at first, hovering near the office district. Then, hours later, the signal shifted, drifting away from the cluster of corporate buildings and into a residential area I didn't recognize. It wasn't a quick stop. The location remained fixed for nearly 2 hours. I told myself there could be explanations, private residences used for executive gatherings, informal dinners hosted by investors, but the address was nowhere near any venue that made sense for her line of work. 2 days later, another alert pinged close to midnight. She had said she needed to review presentation materials with Kyle before an early morning pitch. The map displayed a ride-share stop a few blocks from a high-rise condo complex registered under his name, information I had looked up in a moment of restless insomnia. The signal stayed there long enough to erase any illusion of coincidence. Over the next week, patterns emerged with disturbing consistency. Scheduled client meetings that extended late into the evening aligned with stops in the same neighborhood. Supposed networking events ended not at hotels or restaurants but within walking distance of his building. There were gaps in her calendar where she had claimed back-to-back obligations, yet the tracker showed long stationary periods in places far removed from conference rooms or corporate offices. Each notification tightened something inside me, not explosive anger but a cold, steady resolve. The guilt I had felt that first night dulled with every confirmation, replaced by a growing certainty that I wasn't imagining betrayal or misreading harmless interactions. I wasn't confronting her, wasn't accusing, wasn't even changing my demeanor at home. I was observing, documenting, letting the truth arrange itself without interference. And the clearer the pattern became, the less this felt like suspicion and the more it felt like undeniable evidence of a life she had been living parallel to mine. When I told Lauren I had a short work trip to Seattle, she barely reacted beyond a distracted nod and a reminder not to forget my charger, which felt almost ironic considering the secret life I was now quietly documenting through my phone. The flight gave me too much time to think, to replay every late-night alert and every false explanation she had delivered with such polished ease. By the time I arrived in Seattle, the rain was steady and gray, the kind that blurred the skyline and made everything feel muted and controlled, which somehow matched the state of my thoughts. Victoria's office was in a glass building overlooking the water, minimalist to the point of intimidation. Neutral tones, clean lines, nothing personal on display except a single abstract painting that looked expensive and intentionally ambiguous. When I stepped inside, she greeted me with the same composed expression she had worn on the terrace in Chicago, as if this meeting were simply another scheduled agenda item. There was no small talk about the weather or my flight. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, then slid a thin black folder toward me without ceremony. She told me that as a senior executive she had an obligation to protect the company from internal risks, and that certain patterns had required formal documentation. Her voice was calm, professional, almost detached, but there was an undercurrent of something deliberate in the way she watched my face as I opened the folder. Inside were printed photographs, time-stamped and dated, showing Lauren and Kyle entering his condo building on multiple occasions, leaving together hours later, sometimes early in the morning. There were copies of expense reports highlighting inconsistencies, ride-share logs that contradicted official meeting locations, and a concise report from a private investigator outlining repeated after-hours contact that extended far beyond professional necessity. Seeing it compiled in one place hit differently than watching dots move on a map. The images removed any remaining space for doubt. There was Lauren, laughing outside his building, her hand resting casually on his arm. There was Kyle unlocking the lobby door while she stood close enough to suggest familiarity rather than coincidence. Each timestamp aligned with nights she had told me she was exhausted from client strategy sessions. My chest felt tight, but I refused to let the reaction show in a way that would give anyone, even Victoria, access to something fragile inside me. She leaned back slightly and observed that the situation was not only personal but potentially a violation of company policy, particularly regarding undisclosed relationships between team members working on the same accounts. She mentioned conflicts of interest, reputational risk, and the importance of discretion. Then, almost subtly, the tone shifted. She commented that betrayal has a way of isolating people, that clarity can be stabilizing if handled strategically, and that strong partnerships are sometimes formed in the aftermath of broken ones. The implication lingered in the air longer than the words themselves. I met her gaze steadily and told her I appreciated the information but that I was not looking to replace one compromised dynamic with another. Whatever was happening in my marriage was mine to resolve, and I had no interest in blurring professional boundaries further. For a brief second, something flickered in her expression, not disappointment exactly, but acknowledgement. She nodded once, as if recalibrating her assessment of me. I closed the folder carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands, not just paper and ink but confirmation. I thanked her for her transparency and stood to leave, fully aware that this evidence gave me leverage, clarity, and options. As I stepped back out into the gray Seattle afternoon, the rain felt sharper against my skin, but my thoughts were no longer scattered. I wasn't acting out of suspicion anymore. I was holding proof. And whatever came next would unfold on terms I chose, not one scripted behind my back. By the time I returned from Seattle, I had already decided that anger would be the least useful reaction available to me. Exploding would give Lauren something to fight against, something to redirect, distort, or weaponize. Calm, on the other hand, was destabilizing. 2 days after I got back, I told her casually over breakfast that I had run into Victoria during my trip and that, since she traveled frequently, I had invited her to dinner if she ever found herself in Austin. I delivered the information the same way someone might mention inviting an old colleague for coffee, watching Lauren's face with quiet precision. The shift was immediate and impossible to miss. Her fork paused midair, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she forced a laugh that sounded brittle at the edges. She asked why I would do that, why I would invite her boss into our home without discussing it first. I reminded her that she had always emphasized the importance of networking and maintaining strong professional relationships, and that I simply thought it would be polite. The more neutral I remained, the more agitated she became, as if my lack of visible emotion denied her a script. When I confirmed that Victoria had accepted and would be joining us that Friday, Lauren's composure began to crack in small, revealing ways. She accused Victoria of being manipulative, of enjoying power games, of targeting ambitious employees who threatened her position. She suggested that Victoria might be using me to destabilize her career, framing it as a calculated attempt to create tension at home. The speed at which she constructed that narrative told me she had already imagined the possibility of exposure. Friday evening arrived with a tension that felt almost tangible in the house. Lauren cleaned obsessively, rearranged decorative items twice, and changed outfits 3 times before settling on something that balanced authority with approachability. When Victoria arrived, she was as composed as ever, carrying a bottle of wine and greeting Lauren with professional courtesy that bordered on cold elegance. I watched the two of them exchange smiles that never reached their eyes. Dinner unfolded like a strategic negotiation rather than a social gathering. Every sentence carried subtext. Lauren spoke confidently about upcoming campaigns and team performance, subtly reinforcing her value within the company. Victoria responded with measured acknowledgments, occasionally referencing policy updates or structural reviews that hinted at oversight without making direct accusations. I contributed just enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy, asking about industry trends, commenting on Seattle's weather, keeping my tone steady and unreadable. At one point Lauren turned the focus toward me, mentioning how supportive I had been during her demanding schedule, her gaze lingering as if searching for confirmation of loyalty. I held her eyes calmly and agreed that ambition requires balance, letting the statement sit without elaboration. The silence that followed was brief but charged. For the first time in months, she couldn't read me. She didn't know what I knew, what I had seen, or what had been shared in that minimalist office overlooking the water. After Victoria left, Lauren's restraint dissolved into sharp questions. She accused me of orchestrating the evening to intimidate her, of aligning myself with someone who envied her success. She projected jealousy onto me, suggesting that I felt overshadowed by her career and was seeking validation through her superior. I listened without raising my voice, without denying or confirming anything beyond surface-level responses. The more composed I remained, the more unsettled she became. Our conversations shifted after that night into careful, strategic exchanges filled with half-truths and implied accusations. She tried different approaches: tenderness, defensiveness, indignation, even vulnerability, but none of them landed the way they once might have. The emotional leverage she had relied on depended on predictability, on knowing how I would react. Now there was only stillness where there used to be reassurance or frustration. For the first time since that rooftop in Chicago, I saw uncertainty in her. Not guilt fully formed, not confession, but doubt. She could no longer control the narrative because she didn't know which version of it I was holding. And in that uncertainty, the balance between us shifted quietly but unmistakably. I chose early morning on purpose because arrogance is loudest when it thinks it has another ordinary day ahead of it, and I wanted Kyle to open his door expecting nothing more complicated than a delivery or a neighbor's question about landscaping. His house sat in a polished suburban development just outside the city, all clean lines and oversized windows that projected success without subtlety. The driveway was empty except for a dark sedan I recognized from photographs in the evidence folder, and the lawn looked meticulously maintained, the kind of place designed to reflect upward mobility and control. I stood on his porch with a formal envelope in my hand, my pulse steady in a way that surprised me. Weeks earlier I might have arrived shaking with anger, but by then anger had burned down into something far more controlled. I rang the doorbell once and waited. When he opened the door, he looked disoriented for half a second, clearly not expecting to see me standing there in the early light. His expression shifted quickly into forced composure, the same confident half-smile he wore at the rooftop party in Chicago, but this time there was tension behind it. He asked what I was doing there, his tone carefully casual, and I told him I wouldn't take much of his time. I extended the envelope toward him and explained in a level voice that documentation outlining repeated misconduct and violations of company policy had been formally submitted to HR at Crestline Media Group, where he was employed. I watched the words register in real time. The smile faded first, replaced by a flicker of calculation. He did not immediately take the envelope, as if refusing to touch it might somehow delay its reality. I clarified that the documentation included timestamps, photographs, expense discrepancies, and corroborated reports from an independent investigator, and that the submission was thorough enough to require internal review. I made it clear that this was not a threat and not an emotional outburst but a completed action. I was not there to negotiate or to argue. I was there to inform him that the quiet arrangement he believed was protected by discretion and professional status had already unraveled. He finally took the envelope, his fingers tightening around the edge. He tried to recover his composure by suggesting that whatever I thought I knew was likely exaggerated, that corporate environments bred rumors and that adults were capable of maintaining professional boundaries. The denial sounded rehearsed but hollow, lacking the effortless confidence he displayed when he had his arm around my wife on that glass terrace. I held his gaze steadily and told him I was not interested in interpretations or excuses. I had no intention of fighting him on his porch, no interest in raising my voice or escalating the scene. I wasn't starting anything. I was ending it. For a brief moment, the silence between us felt heavier than any argument could have. The shock on his face, the slight tightening of his jaw, confirmed more than words ever could. He had believed in the safety of secrecy, in the assumption that I would either remain unaware or react emotionally enough to discredit myself. Instead, I had moved quietly, methodically, without spectacle. As I turned to leave, I noticed how different the morning air felt compared to the night on the Chicago terrace when everything first shifted. Back then I had been standing on the outside of something, confused and humiliated. Now I was walking away from his doorstep with clarity and finality. I did not look back to see whether he was still standing there or already tearing open the envelope. The point was not his reaction. The point was that the illusion he had relied on no longer existed, and he knew it the second he saw me at his door. The unraveling happened faster than I expected, almost as if the entire structure had been waiting for a single thread to be pulled. Once HR began its internal review, the focus expanded beyond the undisclosed relationship and into discrepancies neither of them had anticipated being examined so closely. Shared access to confidential campaign data, irregular expense approvals, strategic files sent between personal devices, details that might have remained invisible under normal circumstances were suddenly scrutinized under policy violations and risk assessments. Within weeks, both Lauren and Kyle were terminated for breaching company conduct standards and mishandling protected information. There was no dramatic public spectacle, no scandal splashed across headlines, just formal notices and revoked credentials that quietly dismantled the careers they had tried so carefully to elevate. At home, the performance finally collapsed because there was nothing left to stabilize. Lauren stopped attempting elaborate breakfasts or rehearsed affection. The house felt stripped of pretense, reduced to logistical conversations about attorneys and paperwork. When she realized I already possessed more documentation than she could explain away, the defensiveness drained out of her. What remained was exhaustion. She oscillated between muted anger and a hollow kind of resignation, as if the energy required to maintain parallel narratives had finally run out. The divorce proceedings were procedural and restrained. In court, she looked smaller than I remembered, her posture no longer sharp with ambition but slumped beneath the weight of consequences. There were no explosive confessions, no desperate attempts to rewrite history. The facts were straightforward, the separation categorized under irreconcilable differences, though we both understood how much had been compressed into that phrase. I answered questions clearly, without hostility, without visible bitterness. I refused to let the end of the marriage become another stage for emotional display. The judge processed our case with professional detachment, and when it was over, it ended not with raised voices but with signatures and quiet finality. Walking out of the courthouse, I did not feel triumph. I felt something steadier, a sense of closure earned through restraint rather than chaos. The marriage had not ended in a single explosive moment but through accumulated decisions, and now it concluded the same way, without spectacle. Several weeks later, I found myself in Portland on a separate matter, and I agreed to meet Victoria at a lakeside cafe she recommended. The setting was nothing like corporate terraces or minimalist offices. It was calm, understated, the water stretching out in muted gray beneath an overcast sky. She arrived without the sharp edge she carried in executive settings, dressed simply, her posture relaxed in a way I had not seen before. We sat facing the lake rather than each other at first, the conversation unhurried. There were no strategic undertones, no veiled implications about leverage or positioning. She spoke openly about the aftermath within the company, about structural changes and lessons learned, and then, after a pause that felt intentional but not manipulative, she admitted that she had admired my composure long before the situation reached its peak. She said integrity is rare under pressure, that most people react impulsively when confronted with betrayal, and that she had noticed the difference. There was no flirtation layered into her words, no attempt to capitalize on vulnerability. It felt grounded, honest. For the first time in months, I wasn't calculating responses or observing for subtext. I was simply present. The lake remained still, the air cool but not cold, and the silence between sentences felt comfortable rather than charged. I realized then that moving forward did not require dramatic reinvention. It required steadiness, clarity, and the willingness to let what was broken remain in the past. Whatever came next would not be built on secrecy or performance. It would be built slowly, deliberately, without games. And for the first time since that night on the rooftop in Chicago, the future did not feel like something I needed to control. It felt open.